Lately, one of the key topics in enterprise IT has been edge computing. From AI to 5G, edge is one of the topics that just keeps coming up in every field day discussion. I wanted to talk a little bit about the implications of edge computing and how it's going to change enterprise technology forever. I'm Stephen Foskett, publisher of Gestalt IT, and this is the Checksum. When people think of edge, they often think of 5G and networking, but there's a lot more involved here. In fact, edge computing will touch every element of the IT stack, including storage.
Did someone say 5G and networking?
Hey Tom, nice to see you.
Steven, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm kind of interested a little bit in some of these 5G things that are going on the edge. Do you want to have a conversation about that?
Sure, you can jump into the checksum.
Cool.
So as I was saying, Tom, edge isn't just about network. It's about every element of the compute stack, and it's about moving parts of compute, whether it's servers or storage, all the way out close to the client. Now, it's important to remember that when we talk about edge, we don't mean client devices. So, for example, I'm not referring to your iPhone or even the security camera in your home. What I'm talking about are the devices that are stored at the edge of the network or the expanded, exploded data center. And the reason that companies are doing this, whether it's telecom providers or industrial systems, the reason they're doing this is, of course, to save on transit costs and move compute closer to the data.
And it's great that you mentioned that, Stephen, because when we think back to the history of what I would consider to be really edge computing, it started in the content delivery networks, the folks like Akamai, who were trying to push the content as close as they could to their consumers to save on those massive transit costs through the service providers, the backbone networks. And so by pre-staging all that information in places where it was easily, readily accessible, they didn't have to pay these gigantic hosting bills in order to get things to the people that needed to consume them. And that kind of proved it out to the point where a lot of other companies said, maybe this is something that I really need to investigate as my compute needs became more and more centralized.
And one of the things that's important to realize is that CDNs were primarily about storage, about data, but of course they also did processing at the edge. And this is becoming increasingly important in the web, but also in industrial settings. So we're not talking about just caching data near the client. What we're talking about is actually collecting data from client devices, processing it there at the edge, and maybe moving that data right back, with the processing all happening outside the conventional data center or outside the conventional cloud.
And so we talked a little bit about 5G being a huge driver for edge computing, and it's important to realize that one of the advantages that we keep hearing about with 5G is more efficient utilization of networking resources. Yeah, it's faster, and we know it's going to be faster because that's what all of the people keep telling us, is that this is going to be a new paradigm for the way that we do data. But it's not just faster because we have access to new spectrum. It's faster because we are more efficiently using the resources that we have in places like cellular base stations. So instead of having our mobile phones connecting to a tower and then streaming all of that data directly from a content delivery network node or even the cloud, we're able to stage some of those application resources in the base station itself, so that our mobile devices, which by all accounts are pretty powerful computers already, don't have to go out to fetch that data, which makes things feel faster. And that's one of the huge advantages that a lot of people have told us that 5G gives us, is more control over how we serve content to people.
And this is one of the ways that 5G is really transforming computing. Because back in the day, you see a cell phone tower. Many of you don't know, but there's actually a data center underneath that. That data center is actually kind of confusingly called a central office. But the data center that's at each of those base stations, each of those towers, is made up of all sorts of complex systems, complex specialty components that are designed to handle network processing there. But they really can't handle much of anything else because they're specialized devices. Now, one of the things that's happening with 5G, and this is incredibly important to and relevant to this discussion, is that virtualization and containerization and Kubernetes, these are being deployed in what's now calling the redesigned central office.
It's important to realize that 5G base stations aren't the only place that are taking advantage of things like edge computing. One of the biggest growth areas is in industrial IoT. And when I say industrial, I don't mean your thermostat. I mean big, giant commercial machines that are doing very important work that are not computers. They are machines. But we are learning how to tap into the power that they can provide to give us data. And it's very important to realize that the amount of data that these machines can generate would quickly overwhelm any kind of cloud system. And it needs to be dealt with where it is collected.
And that's one of the things that's come up on the Utilizing AI podcast and at the AI Field Day event. A lot of these industrial IoT systems are actually using machine learning to process data near the point of collection. That improves the latency and responsiveness of those applications, but of course it also allows them to filter the data in real time using machine learning so that only the important data goes back to the core of the compute infrastructure. This has allowed companies and industrial IoT to collect more data and faster data locally than, as I said, to process that and filter that and act on it right there at the edge.
Now, we talked a little bit about 5G, we talked a little bit about industrial IoT, but it's important to realize that the concepts that we're dealing with here can apply to any one of a number of new connectivity technologies. Now, you probably have heard, or if you've watched one of the previous episodes of Tomversations, about new Wi-Fi connectivity like Wi-Fi 6 and Wi-Fi 6E, which are taking some of these concepts and applying them. But it's also important to realize that new technologies like CBRS, which is also known as private LTE, give us these capabilities. You don't have to rely on a provider to give you the capability to deploy edge computing. You can do it yourself if you have a campus that has a necessity to do these kinds of things, but you want to own the stack from top to bottom, from central to edge.
And many of these things are made possible through the use of consumer technologies or technologies that were pioneered in consumer devices. So things like the CPUs and the sensors and the radios in phones are being deployed in enterprise and industrial IoT settings to bring this whole world of edge computing to life. What's also happening, of course, is that these technologies are going to be impacting the consumer. So pretty soon, the applications that are available on your phone, whether it's something from gaming to shopping or to something in industrial or healthcare or manufacturing settings, might be able to have more data and better data, maybe machine learning processing, thanks to the fact that compute is distributed to the edge.
You're going to hear a lot about edge computing over the next few months because it's a hot area that a lot of people are investing a lot of resources in. And some of it's going to sound confusing, and some of it honestly may not even make sense. But all you have to do is sit down and remember that all edge computing is moving the resources that you care about closer to where you live and doing things with them there so that it's cheaper to transmit that data and that it's more efficient to deal with it where it lives. And if you remember that, then the rest of everything that's involved with edge computing, no matter how it's being transmitted, what it's being processed on, or what you're going to be able to do with it, makes a whole lot more sense. I want to thank Stephen Foskett for joining me for this episode of Tomversations.
And I want to thank Tom Hollingsworth for joining me for this episode of Checksum.
Now, we have a lot more great episodes tackling a lot of great technologies of both Tomversations and Checksum if you head over to gestaltit.com. You can also check out our YouTube channel at youtube.com/gestaltitvideo, where you can learn a lot about some of the great technologies that we're interested in and hear our take on how they're going to impact your life and your work in the future. I hope that you'll join me very soon for another episode of Tomversations.
And I hope you'll join me very soon for another episode of the Gestalt IT Checksum.